Let's take a look at what we're going to be discussing today. So first, we're going to just walk through some definitions of what is tenancy, tenants, and multi-tenant applications. We have a few examples of different types of those and talk about what their deployments might look like. And then we're going to go into some specific multi-tenant deployment scenarios with one of those application types. And we'll talk about deploying to shared versus dedicated infrastructure, how to handle like alpha deployments, how to customize your process for different categories of your tenants, and even treating your team or team members as tenants of your application. And as Mark mentioned, we'll jump back for the Q&A. So let's kick off with a definition. The Octopus definition of a tenant is it is a isolated instance of your application in an environment. So if you have, let's say, a test environment and you have 3 isolated instances of that application running, so for 3 different purposes, those are 3 tenants of your test environment. Now, commonly, tenants are used to represent your customers. So if you have like a software as a service application, or even if you deploy directly to your customer's infrastructure, you could model tenants as your customers of your application, and you're deploying to them that way, different versions to those customers. Now, if you're thinking, well, we don't really have customers and we don't deploy that way, so maybe tenants aren't for us, I'm going to show you some other use cases where tenants can actually be used in your application where you're not modeling customer deployments. Things like deploying to different teams or team members, geographical regions, data centers, and there's even some other use cases beyond that. So having defined that, let's look at a few application types after this graphic of kind of like modeling that definition. We have an environment, and in here you can see 4 different isolated instances of our application. So 4 different tenants here. And now they may be on shared infrastructure and they may be on like separate dedicated infrastructure. It doesn't really matter. It's just that the applications are separate. They have their own resources and they have their own purpose. A common multi-tenant application setup, and this is one that I'm pretty familiar with. It was one of the applications I used to work on in a different team, is to have all of your tenants or customers log into a single application. And that single application is tied to a single database. And you have to do some work at the application database level to keep that data separate so that they're not accessing the data of other tenants. That would be a bad outcome. Now, when we think about deploying to this type of application, it's not really that different than deploying to a single tenant or a non-tenanted application. There's a single app, there's a single database. Everybody's on the same version. You're doing one deployment. Everybody gets upgraded at the same time. And if you want any like difference between your tenants, if you want to say this customer has these features and this customer doesn't, you'll need to implement something like feature flags or feature toggles to manage that in a single app and database. Another common and pretty familiar to this one or similar is a single application, but we actually separate the customer data out into different databases. So like a little bit more isolation at the customer level. You're accessing the data through different connection strings that you determine when the customer logs into your application or the tenant logs into your application. And it keeps that separate in that way. So it's still a single application and multiple databases. So similar deployment pattern, everybody's on the same application version, which usually means the database has to be the same version too, right? Like it's the same schema. You may do one-off deployments to do some data manipulation on behalf of your customer, say like fix some corrupted data or add data, remove data for them. But for the most part, everybody's getting updated at the same time in the same deployment. The last use case we're going to look at is actually the one we're going to use today for our demos, because it really showcases the tenancy feature of Octopus and multi-tenant deployments. And this is the case where each tenant has its own application and its own database. So customer 1 is completely separate from everyone else. I can update them on their own schedule. I can put them onto their own version. I can even modify the deployment to have different assets if needed. So maybe there's extra steps. Maybe they have a custom package that updates the CSS of their website that's separate from everybody else's. So really with this case, we have the ability to do separate deployments per tenant and update each individually or as a group. All right, now that we've defined that and walked through those, let's go into Octopus and look at a demo. So I've got a number of projects set up here that's going to showcase some of these use cases. And before we get into those, I'm actually going to go up to the tenants section and look at what tenants are and how to configure them in Octopus. So once this loads, you'll notice that I have a number of tenants that represent things that look like customers. I have some things like Derek Campbell and Ryan Rousseau that would be team members, test 1 through 5 for test systems, and even a few geographical regions. So all of these are modeled as tenants for the demo, but I'm going to start with opening a customer tenant, Big Dog Sanctuary. So once we load the overview, we'll see on the overview screen which projects this tenant is tied to. So which multi-tenant projects it can be deployed to. And for each of those, which environments it can be deployed to. Now, in this case, it's a tie to my 3 main environments: development, test, and production. But when you go to connect a project for a tenant, Dev probably is the best one to show this. You can select any number of environments. In this case, Dev and Test are the only options, but I could say this is a development only tenant, or this is a production only tenant, which may be the case for a lot of customer type tenants. So you can choose to deploy to a smaller set of environments. It just so happens this one goes through our alpha process and they have their own development testing environment. Now on the right side, we'll see our tag sets. And if you've used the machine role or target role feature of Octopus, this will be somewhat familiar to you. It's a little more advanced than the target roles, where you can actually define a set of tags that can be applied to a tenant. So in this case, we have 4 sets. We have release ring, tenant type, features, and hosting type. And then we have 1 or more tags from each of those sets applied to this tenant. So if we look at manage, we can see, well, they are in the alpha release ring. We could also choose beta or stable. They are a customer type. These are some features they have. So we can choose which features are applied to different tenants if they are optional. And then they are on shared hosting versus dedicated hosting. And you can use these tag sets for a number of things, and we'll see it throughout this demo, but you can use these for scoping variables, scoping your process steps, really just like informational purposes. You don't necessarily have to tie it to anything else in the system. It could just be something that you attach to your tenant to have extra information there. And also you can use this for mapping your infrastructure to your tenants. So those are the tag sets. Next, I want to look at the settings where you can give, besides the logo and the name, you can also add a description to your tenant, which will show up on this sidebar here. So this is a nice area to go in and give a description, kind of give some context around what this tenant is. And you can use some subset of Markdown to actually provide links. So if we wanted to look at the development site for this project, we can open that up and see that it is loading. Close that, and we have links to test and production also. Now note, this isn't like automatically pulled in or anything. I just happen to know the URLs, so I have coded it into the Markdown for this description for the tenant. And lastly, let's take a look at variables. So there's 2 types of variables. The first one we'll see are project variables, and these are values that vary per project and per environment that it is tied to. So we can see we have development variables, test variables, and production. Now it's the same group of variables for each environment, but they have different values. So for this project, we can see at dev, test, and production, I can set a database name, site path, what port to use, etc. So you can have those different values per project, per environment. We can also see common variables, and these come from library variable sets. So we can see we've got common tenant information, and these do not vary per project or per environment, but these will be used by any project that imports this variable set. So we can see I've got a contact name, email, number, and then a tenant key that I use for my infrastructure as code scripts for declaring that infrastructure in Terraform. So common variables that don't vary per project or environment, but they can be used to store common information that would be going across all projects where you would use this tenant. So those are the two type of tenant variables. And if we look, all right, so I think that's covered a tenant pretty well. So we've got the variables, the settings, and we've got the tag sets. Let's jump to the library and actually look at how we would set up the tag sets. So you can see I've got my 4 tag sets that we've defined here with all the possible settings. Now I could go into one of these tag sets and add a new value. I could tap in, tie in like a post stable tag if I wanted to, change its color and add it. So now I would have a new value that I could use throughout my release ring tags. I can also add a completely new tag set. So if I had a tag set for a new purpose, I could give it a description if needed, and then also add some tags for it. But I will not save this one, but this is pretty easy to go in and add those tag sets for whatever use you may have for them. And then once they're added, you can apply those to your tag sets and start using them in your process and your infrastructure. From here, we'll look at the variable sets, and you can see I've got my tenant information variable set. And you'll have the normal variable screen that you're used to, but if you want to create those common variables for the tenant, you want to navigate over to variable templates. And now you can see those 4 values we saw before: contact name, email, number, and that key with the default value. And you can see the default value is just taking that tenant name, making it lowercase, and then replacing spaces with a dash. Let's actually open this up and see what a variable template looks like. So you can see it's got a variable name, and this would be the variable name you use to reference the value in your process or your deployment scripts. You can give it a label for display on the screen. So when you're looking at that tenant variable screen, it will say, what is the key? You can give some help text to provide any extra context for somebody who's filling this out. And then you could choose the variable type, whether it's a single line text box, a sensitive password, or an account or certificate. So a lot of variable options there. Then you can go in and set a default value if you need to. If you do have a default value, especially if it's one that you can use to reference like an existing system variable or another variable, it's very handy. So it keeps you from having to type in a value over and over if it's something that you can calculate. And then you'd only have to change the variable value in cases where it differs. All right, so let's cancel that. So that is how you create those common variable templates. Going to now, let's see, so we looked at tag sets and variable sets. That's everything under the library. Let's quickly go to infrastructure. And you may be asking, how do I deploy to different targets within the same environment if I'm using tenants? I don't want to deploy my tenant website to all 5 of my web servers in test or production. In this case, you actually attach those targets to a tenant. So when these targets load, you'll see that we've got some non-tenanted targets, like this one that's highlighted. It's in the development environment and it has this role, but it's not tied to any tenant compared to the ones below it. We've got 3 production targets here, production web targets, and they're tied to specific tenants. So when we deploy to Dallas Animal Rescue and production for this role, it will use this target and ignore the other ones. You can also see that we've got a shared VM for production, and it's not tied to a specific tenant, but it's tied to a tenant tag. So any tenant that has the shared tag, if you deploy to that tenant, it will use this target. And once we open this target, we can go down to the bottom, and you've got these restrictions here. So you can tell it whether it's excluded or included in tenant deployments, or it can be used for both. And then you can choose how to associate the tenants to it. You can select directly, or you can use a tag or a combination of tags. One feature that I think is often overlooked, at least often overlooked by me, is the tenant preview. And if you open this, you get the same selection screen, but it'll actually show you which tenants will apply to that. So you can see it's not only my customers, but it's also my test environments and team members. If I wanted to say, no, I I really only want this to apply to customers, I could use that tenant type tag and choose customer here, and it'll combine the shared and customer, and then I get the 3 that I want. But I'm happy for it to be all shared, so I will leave it as it is. But this preview screen is really nice, really handy to see exactly which tenants will be used for this target. So that is how you tie your infrastructure to your tenants for deployments. Now that we've laid the groundwork for tenants and their variables and tag sets and how they work with infrastructure, let's jump into the projects. And I want to start by looking at a single tenant project, just so we can highlight some of the differences between the single tenant and multi-tenant projects. So if we're going to look at this, if you're not using multi-tenancy today, this is going to look pretty standard. I've got a overview screen that shows my previous releases, where they are in the pipeline, the life cycle, and I can deploy as needed. If we look at the process, it's going to be a pretty standard process. I've got a few steps for infrastructure as code. So I'm creating a database in VM with Terraform. I'm performing a health check to automatically pull in that new VM if it was created into the deployment, deploying my application out, and then I'm printing the URL to the logs for easy access. So pretty standard deployment process. And if we look at the variables, I have a number of configuration variables for the application. I've got some project level variables that I use for configuring the deployment. So what is the database connection string? What's the Nginx location, et cetera, what port to use. And then I have a collection of variables that are for Terraform specifically. So for spinning up that database and that web server. So nothing out of the ordinary here. A small set of variables, but pretty standard variables. Now, if you have a application that is single tenant and you're thinking, well, after seeing some of these use cases, or eventually you need to add customer deployments to it, you want to take this application and make it multi-tenant, you have 2 options. You can clone it and make that a multi-tenant application. The downside there is you have to basically maintain 2 copies of that application. What you may want to do instead is go to settings, and under multi-tenant deployments, change it from disable tenanted deployments to allow deployments with or without a tenant. And this would allow you to build your tenanted deployment process on top of your existing one, and you could do non-tenanted and tenanted deployments in the same project. I will leave that as is. And in the next example, I'll show you if you're starting from scratch. One thing I like to do for the non-tenanted deployments, I'll show you a pattern that I use in the next project. Be basically the same application, but in a tenanted context. Now, the first thing you'll notice is our overview screen, we don't have a list of releases down the side anymore. We have our tenants, our customers, including this one called internal. And this is usually what I do in the case where I want a non-tenanted deployment. I want to deploy to my internal testing sites or my internal infrastructure. And the name internal isn't special. It can be really whatever you want to call it, but internal is the name that I choose. So instead of having a mixed mode where it's an untenanted deployment to go to dev and test, I can have an internal tenant. And the reason I like to do this is if you do an untenanted deployment, it's not using your tenant tags, it's not taking the tenant variables into account, versus setting it up as a internal tenant. I have to set the variables like I do for all my other tenants. I can apply tags to it and then make sure that process is working the same for my internal deployments and when I do go to deploy my customers to production. So a little digression there, but getting back to the tenants, we can see them listed and we can see for each environment what version of the app has been deployed to them. And you'll notice that some of these have the no sign here. That's because these tenants are not attached or assigned to the dev or test environments. So for Chicago Cat Rescue, they only go to production. Now the lifecycle rules are still in place. So I couldn't just create a new release and deploy directly to production. It would need to go to development and test for at least one other tenant before you could deploy it to production for others. From here, I can, if I wanted to deploy a specific release, I could choose that release and then it filters this tenant overview screen by that release. So I can see where it's already gone to. I can see where it's available to be deployed. I can deploy to all tenants at once if I'd like to. And I can also combine this with the group by. And I really like using this feature, like especially with release spring, because then I can see who are my alpha tenants. Okay, I want to deploy to all of my alpha tenants right now. Maybe I want to deploy by hosting type and deploy to my shared tenants before I deploy to any dedicated tenants. So this is one area where those tenant tags come into place, and you may find yourself creating tenant tags specifically for the grouping feature on this page. All right, so that's the overview screen, and those are the differences there. Let's look at the process. Process is going to be relatively untouched with the exception of some tags on certain steps and a new step. So in this case, I'm creating my database every time because every customer is getting their own database, but it's only creating the VM and running the health check if it's a dedicated hosting type tenant, because I need to make sure their VM exists. If it does, it's just going to run through these steps pretty quickly. But if it doesn't exist, it'll create a new VM and deploy to that. Now, if it's a shared tenant, these steps will be skipped because the shared infrastructure already exists. I have it in place from setting up the application before. So this is one way to customize your deployment process to your different tenants. And lastly, with the last step, you can see that we're going to send an email to the email that's listed in that common variable, that contact email variable. And we're only sending the email if they have the deployment notification feature. So this illustrates how you can have different features deployed or different assets or functionality deployed based on the tenant using those tenant tags. From here, let's jump to variables. Now, roughly the same. I've got the same number of variables and the same variable names, but what you may see is now the variable values are referencing my tenant values that we set at the tenant screen. So we've got tenant.site.navbar color. The site path is being used in place. I've got a complex variable value there. But if we scroll down, we can also see there's different values depending on whether it's a dedicated tenant or a shared tenant or dedicated versus all other tenants. So you can see there are different values that are being used for Terraform, mostly for Terraform because it depends on how that gets created. Now, one thing you may ask, how do I set these? Because if you just open the defined scope, you'll see that you've got the normal scoping options, but you don't see the tenant tags. To get to the tenant tags, you need to open the editor. And once you open the editor, you have your tags selected, and you can use that same tenant preview. So I could go in and say, this is for all alpha customers, for example. When I create a release, the create release is the same, but you'll notice a difference when you go to deploy a release. So if I want to deploy this new release to development, I now have a tenant section. So I can choose the tenants directly. I can choose based on one of the tag types. And I can use that tenant preview to make sure I'm deploying to the tenants that I want to deploy to and don't have any surprises. Or I can choose to deploy to all of the tenants that are connected to this environment. So once I hit deploy, this is normally where we would go to a deployment task log and you would see all of your steps being run. But when you're doing a tenant deployment, if you deploy to multiple tenants at once, those are separate tasks. So each tenant deployment is going to be a separate task, which is important to note if you have more tenants than you have set on your task cap. If you have a task cap of 10 and you try to deploy to 50 tenants at once, you're going to have a lot of queuing. So you want to make sure you either increase your task cap and make sure that your Octopus server has the resources to support that, or look into setting up multiple nodes through the high availability mode, or you do your deployments to your tenants in release rings so that you only deploy to maybe 10 at a time, if that's the case. So those two will run. We'll see on the overview that the deployment's running. And once they finish, then we could promote those to the other environments. So this is really just illustrating the difference between the non-tenanted and the multi-tenant project and how you can use those features. One thing I did skip in variables, let me go back to it, is project templates. So this is where you set those templates for your project variables for each tenant. So it's exactly the same screen as setting up that template at the library variable set. So it's very similar, it is the same screen, same process. So you go in and set that up, but this is where you create those templates that you set at the tenant for the project level. You can also see the common variable templates that are in use that are being pulled in by your variable sets. You can't add them here, but you can see them. And one thing I'd like to point out is another preview screen. So we saw the preview tenant screen from the infrastructure page that's also in a few other places. The preview variable screen will show you the variable values that are being used in a certain environment, even down to the step, but you can also change out the tenant and you can see what values are being used. Now, it can only show you things that it can calculate because we're not in the context of a release right now. Release that number doesn't exist, so it's just kind of showing that there. But for everything else that it can calculate, those are showing up. So it's a good way to check your variables before doing a deployment. All right, so variables, deployments, the overview, this all looks great. So this is the standard use case of we're deploying to customers. What if we want to deploy, like have our team members, our different developers deploy? It's exactly the same. So this project is a clone. The only difference between the previous project and this one is that the tenants are different. I'm using the tenants that represents myself and a coworker versus a customer. I also have a different life cycle because I don't necessarily want any testing deployment to go to production, but I have my own development environment. I have my own test environment that I can push changes to, and we can test those from there. Other than that, everything is the same. Now, you may want to keep these separated, and you may think that you do want to keep these separated because you don't want to mix your like test or / development deployments from your developers or your testing team members and your production customer releases. The downside, again, if you do clone this project, that means you have to keep them both up to date, which that could be a upside and a downside. Maybe you only want changes to your process, like development changes to come here, and then you migrate them over. It's a little bit more work. Some people prefer to do that. It's not the option I would choose in most cases, but you can combine these projects. So I can have the same, like one project that has customers and developers as tenants shared together. Now, there's a few concerns here. You may say, well, I've got 20 customers and 20 developers, and this list is in alphabetical order, and it's hard to find anything. I would say this is where that grouping comes back into place, create that tenant type grouping so that I can see my customers versus my developers, testers, feature branches, etc., like any like non-customer type. The other thing is you may say, well, I don't want a release from Ryan Rousseau to make it a test and then be available to go to production for a customer. And that's a very valid point. In this case, I would say look at the channels feature. And I have a channel for the default channel is only going to be able to deploy to customers and is using the default lifecycle. And we have the test channel, which can only deploy releases in this channel can only be deployed to testers. And it's using the dev lifecycle, so it doesn't even have production as an option. So if we go and create a release here and we choose the test channel, we can click save. And on the deployment screen, we'll notice one, that it auto selects tester for us. It's trying to be helpful, but I don't want to deploy to all testers. But if I go to select tenant, it will have only my tester tenants. I can't deploy this to customers. Likewise, if I had chosen the default channel, it would have been customers only. And you can also see this from the overview screen. If you filter to a release, it's got the channel listed there. So we choose a default. We can see it can only go to customers that have the development environment anyway. And if we go back and look at a test one, It can only go to the testers. So there are ways to go in and separate your customers from your other use case tenants and also protect the releases from going to the wrong environment. Another thing you can do is with the team permissions, you can set your development team to only be able to see the test or the development tenant types. And you can set your release engineer team to only be able to see the customers, in which case when they log in and they go to this project, they wouldn't see the tenants they don't have permission to see. So that would be another way to kind of separate that out. But I do like this approach of having them in one project because it's less maintenance. You just have to do a few extra steps to make sure that you're not deploying the wrong release to the wrong environment or wrong tenant. All right, let's look at a few more use cases. So I mentioned multi-region. So this is another use case we see tenants being used for by customers. So I have internal infrastructure for development and test, maybe just development and maybe test should be at the region. Maybe there's staging in between here, but the idea is I can deploy to my internal infrastructure for development and test. And when I get to production, maybe I've got multiple regions or data centers. I'm deploying to Central US and West Europe, or maybe Central US is my main, and I have another one that is my disaster recovery or failover and data center. If you want to deploy to those at different times, maybe you want to deploy to Central US first, and then a few hours later or a few days later, you want to deploy to your other data centers, do a rolling deployment that way. You can model those as tenants and then have those separated out. You can also do this as separate environments, production-Central US, production-West Europe. It works pretty much the same way. You tweak your life cycle to have those in the same phase so you can or maybe not in the same phase if you want to mandate a promotion path. But what you'll find is this pattern may be better for you if you have multiple regions where you don't necessarily want to have a large number of environments. You want to limit your environments, but have the flexibility to deploy to different regions within, say, production. And finally, another use case, and this is one that I've had previously, actually using Octopus in the past before the Tenants feature came out. If you have multiple test environments, so you have a large team and there's a lot of changes in flight that all need to be QA'd, you may have a handful, 5 to 10 test environments that are constantly getting deployments. Maybe the deployment changes every day. One team has their own test environment, or it's kind of just round robin, which one's available, instead of creating 5 different test environments, which would make your life cycle and your environment list grow horizontally. You can set those up as tenants. So you have one test environment, but you can have different deployments of that application. And these can each go to different infrastructure or go to that shared infrastructure, depending on your needs and how you set it up. So another good way to use the tenant feature to in a way that's not customer centric. So just because you don't have customers that you're deploying to doesn't mean the tenant feature wouldn't have value to you. And I believe that is it. I'll stay on this screen in case I need to reference anything for Q&A, but Mark, do we have any questions?
Thanks, Ryan. That was a really thorough overview of multi-tenancy there. So yeah, I've got a few questions for you. One is there anything that would be an indicator in my Octopus instance that I should consider using multi-tenancy over how they currently have things configured? So are there, I guess, like any warning signs?
Yeah, so the main thing would be the horizontal growth or like environment sprawl. So development, test 1, test 2, test 3, things like that. If you're have a large number of environments, maybe tenants is the answer. I've also seen customers not using the tenancy feature, but they're deploying to customers. They end up creating like a environment per customer. So production-customer 1, production-customer 2. But to also limit the deployments for that, they have to create a life cycle for that customer. And then that ends up being a channel for that customer. And then every time they add a customer, I've got to add an environment and a life cycle and a channel. And when you're adding that much stuff, it's like, well, look at tenancy, because in that case, you would only be adding a single tenant versus 3 other assets or resources.
Excellent. Great answer and great question. So another question is there a way to bulk update tenant project variables?
Bulk update. So you're saying like update the variables for multiple projects within a
Yeah,
like.
so a customer has they've got tenants for each retail store on a project and project variables specific to each tenant, and they want to update all values of them for each of the
Yeah,
tenants.
in that case, I would point them to the API. So again, everything you can do through the UI, there's an API endpoint backing it. So for complicated or more complex use cases like that, crafting an API script that can go through and easily update all of those would be the solution.
Excellent, thanks for that. So I've got a question in Zoom. One said, currently the Octo plugin for TeamCity cannot deploy to multiple tenants and environments in one step. Is this likely to be improved?
Cannot deploy to multiple tenants and environments in one step. For multiple tenants, maybe that's something we'll have to take that feedback back to the team, the product team, to see if it can be improved. I don't know why it wouldn't, but I don't know the details on that. Deploying to multiple environments is a different case because normally you've got that path, right? The lifecycle limitations. Unless you set up your dev and test in the same phase, for example, you can't deploy to them at the same time because it would need to pass dev first. So that's something I would say email your specific use case to advice@octopus.com so we can know the details. But yeah, definitely the multiple tenants at once is something we can look at.
Sounds good, yeah. I've had one in community Slack. So someone's got J. Gary Thompson's got, I have dev test staging environments and life cycles and a single production environment. I'm about to add a second production environment in a warm state in another physical location for a blue-green type situation. Would it make sense to use tenants to split the two production environments as they will never be updated at the same time?
So like having a blue tenant and a green tenant for production. I was actually thinking about this week, preparing for the webinar. I was wondering if that's a good use case for it. Honestly, I don't know why it wouldn't be. I couldn't think of a reason why it wouldn't be. It's something I think I would have to try to see if it works. I think the hardest part of that is the same as if you're using environments, right? It's knowing which one's the active one, which right now you just kind of have to look at the version that's in there and know that when I deploy to production, I'm deploying to the one that wasn't deployed to last time. But yeah, I could see blue-green deployments having a blue environment and a green environment as a use case for tenants. I would say try it and make sure it works to see it works to your satisfaction.
Yeah, that's good. That's actually someone else asked that exact question. So could it be used for green-blue deployments as well?
Yeah, I think probably maybe this week I'll explore that further. I'll set up a test and see if there's anything I don't like with that solution. But I was thinking about it this week, like, because it's the same, it's almost similar to having different data centers, right? I'm deploying to central US versus a data center in Europe. I'm deploying to blue versus I'm deploying to green. Do I really need another environment for that? Or can I use a tenant?
Yeah. So we've got another question from Mark. We have a few tenants that are on the same virtual machine. Is there a way to run some of the steps at the same time? Currently, Octopus will only run one step at a time across tenants.
Octopus will only run one step at a time across tenants. I think this is because of the mutex. So by default, Octopus will only run one step at a time on a tentacle. There is a variable you can set, and I would say reach out to us at Advice and we can point you at the right documentation. But there is a variable you can set in your project to have it ignore the mutex and basically allow multiple steps to run on the same target at the same time. Now, there are some caveats there. You need to make sure whatever you're running are actions that can happen at the same time. Like you don't want to try and write to the same file or access the same resources that are one access at a time only.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So another question from Darren. Currently, I have some complicated scenarios where a project variable can reference a tenant variable, which in turn can reference a library set project variable. If I look at the variable preview feature, sometimes it comes through as a variable name rather than the evaluated value. Is this something that could be improved? I guess, again, this will be a feature request, so perhaps email Advice at Octopus.
Yeah, I'd say pass that over to Advice with your setup so we can replicate it. But if it's not If it's something that has a value and it's not calculating, it's something we can point out to the team and see if it can be improved. But if it's something that is if it's calculated at like deploy time, like release number, for example, but there's a lot of other values there too as well, then that may be the cause of it.
So I've got another one in community Slack. Can packages referenced in a step of the process be versioned or tagged for different tenants?
Yes, for the package name can, but the version will have to match. So if we go into actually, and it's the same whether you use a tenant variable or you have a non-tenanted project. Where is it? So if I go into my project that deploys a package, so here I'm just setting the package ID directly. You can bind this to a variable. So you could bind this to a tenant variable, or maybe you just add the tenant name like after the fact. So this is not the variable name, but you know, your tenant variable, your tenant name, you could add that on there. The caveat there is it's only varied by package ID. It doesn't vary by version. So it would have to be the same version for that package for all the tenants.
Cool. Excellent. One final question, which is what would the options be for authentication for tenants? So is there any supportability for tenants in kind of like, I guess, accounts and infrastructure perhaps?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Can you go over it again?
Yeah, so the question is, what would be the options of tenant authentications? So is it possible to have different authentication for different tenants?
Oh, so like say if I'm doing my infrastructure of code and I wanted to use a different like Azure subscription, for example.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So one thing you can do, well, you set it up in a few different ways. So this is our demo account. You can associate this. So this is any dedicated or shared tenant can use this account. But also if you wanted to change out the account on a per tenant level, that's where I would say set up and of course this isn't the right screen to do it, but when you set up your tenant variable, create a variable type that is a account. So if I add a new template, this could be the tenant.azure.account that it's going to use, and then you could choose Azure account or AWS account or certificate at that point. But you do need to make sure that that account in the infrastructure screen has the tenant associated with it as well.
Excellent. Cool. Okay, I think that should do it for the question segment for now. Thanks very much for that, Ryan.
Let me jump back. Q&A is taken care of. All right, Mark, take us out.
Cool. So as we mentioned at the start, we are recording this webinar and we'll send this out in the next 24 to 48 hours. That includes some links to all the resources Ryan has brought together for this session. So that's going to be things like the deployment patterns on multi-tenancy, the documentation there, some videos. It's also worth mentioning we've got a starter edition for both self-hosted and Octopus Cloud for you to try out. And that's free for up to 10 deployment targets. And you can also find details of all of our upcoming events, including our next webinars on octopus.com/events. Ryan, thanks again for that presentation. That was great. And thank you to everybody that attended today. Next up on March the 4th, we have an Octopus 101 getting started with Leanne Crocker and Adam Close. We'll also be adding more topics in the coming months. So if there is one you'd like to see, do let us know. Reach out to us on the community Slack or advice@octopus.com. Hopefully you can come along to one soon. Thanks, everyone.